Hello and welcome back to The Cup That Cheers. I'm Elizabeth, and today we're finishing our series on the kinds of tools that I think beginning hand sewers need when you start sewing. We're going to be talking about beeswax or other kinds of wax or conditioners for your thread. We're going to be talking about bandages and why you need them, and we're going to be talking about thimbles. One thing you're definitely going to need as a hand sewer is beeswax. Now, why beeswax? Well, beeswax is used in hand sewing as a thread conditioner. When you, for example, are washing your hair or taking care of your hair, a conditioner for your hair smooths out your hair, helps to keep it from getting tangled, and also makes it a little bit easier to disentangle, take out any knots that do appear in your hair. Beeswax will do the same thing for hand sewing thread. Once you get started sewing, you'll start to notice that as the thread goes through the fabric sort of puts pressure and tension and friction on the thread as it's just going through and going through. And that causes the thread to get kind of fluffy. It causes the thread to start to fray a little bit. And it also, because thread is twisted to make the thread, it starts to untwist it. It starts to twist it in different ways, which causes the thread to start to curl up and get all knotted on its own. And that's really annoying. Once you're starting or sewing your seam, it's really annoying to have to stop and pick out knots all the time. Natural fiber threads tend to do this more than synthetic fiber threads, but polyester, for example, will do that also. So the way you help prevent that from happening is you put a thin layer of beeswax on your thread, and that is a lubricant and makes the thread slide through the fabric a lot easier. It helps it to not get tangled up. It helps it to not fray and get all rough and pull on the fabric as you're trying to move it through. But it also strengthens the thread, especially with natural fiber fabrics and natural fiber threads. Once you get started sewing, if you use a lot more natural fibers like 100% cotton thread or especially 100% linen thread, that will really help. Now, beeswax can come in several different forms. When you find it in the fabric store, it's usually in a case like that. You can see that my beeswax is well used, and I do have another disc. You can buy replacement discs of wax once yours starts looking like this. You can buy them separately, but that's not the only way you can get it. You can buy fun little shapes on Etsy. You can buy shaved beeswax online and melt it yourself and make it into your own shapes. This is a little bit of beeswax that I got at a sewing workshop where they gave all of us sewing supplies as well. But you can also just get a chunk of it like that. And that's about an ounce or an ounce and a half of beeswax. And I would recommend that you get organic beeswax if you can, especially if you're buying it online. When you buy it from the store, it's been treated with chemicals, it's been bleached, so it's not bad to use, but especially if you are working with children or if you are yourself under age 18, you might want to minimize the amount of chemicals that you are handling, because you're going to be handling not only the wax but the thread that has the wax on it. A lot of people lick their fingers and then tie a knot in the thread, and once you're doing that repeatedly, you're going to get some wax, ingest minute amounts of wax. But the way that you use it is you have your thread and needle, and this is before you tie. You thread the needle, and then before you tie the knot in the end, you take your wax, and this one has little openings that you can put your thread through, and you just put the thread on top of the wax. You sort of give a gentle pressure on the thread and then pull the wax, pull the thread over the wax. If you're using a piece of wax like this, you put your thread on top of the wax, put your finger on top of the thread, and just give a gentle pressure, making sure that the wax remains in contact with the thread the entire time, and pull the thread across. Generally do that twice, make sure it's on both sides of the thread, and then that should last and help keep your thread lubricated and nice and smooth, and it shouldn't get tangled very much until at least until you get close enough to the needle that you can cut the thread and start a new thread anyway. So that is something that's really important to have. There are lots of different vendors online. You could go to a farmer's market if you happen to have a honey vendor. Go and approach them and see if they also have things made out of beeswax, and if they can sell you a little 1/2 ounce or 1 ounce chunk of beeswax. That would be good as well. My students smelled the beeswax that I bought them because it still smelled like honey, and they said, "Oh, I want to eat it." And I said, "Don't eat it, but it's safe, no chemicals, but it's not good for eating." So as long as you have some kind of beeswax to wax your thread with, that will make sewing by hand go a lot easier. Another thing that is important to have is band-aids. Like I said earlier, you will be poking yourself with pins. I had to tell my students when I showed them the band-aids, they said, "There's band-aids? You're giving us band-aids? Are we going to be hurting ourselves?" And I said, "Well, you're not going to be cutting any limbs off or anything." One of the good things about hand sewing is that you are in complete control of your materials. You don't have to worry about a machine with an engine or a motor that's running and gets out of hand. You don't have to worry about that. Even though sewing machines are easy to run and they're easy to stop. They're easy to keep yourself safe with that. That's a whole different video series. But with hand sewing, you're not going to be making major cuts in yourself, as long as you're going through reasonable precautions about keeping yourself safe from your scissors, making sure, for example, your scissor blades are closed when you put the scissors down so you don't accidentally run your hand into the open blades, making sure you're not gesturing when you have a seam ripper or pins or needles or scissors in your hand. But just in the act of sewing, you're going to get poked. You're going to poke your fingers with your needles, with your pins, for at least once for every project, I would say. And so it's a good idea, and I would say it's necessary to have some bandages in the house. Even so, I would even go so far as to recommend that you have band-aids in your sewing kit. That is what the tiny band-aids are for. So I have a small round size there. You can also get the small strip sizes if you can find them. They're good for if you're shaving or get a paper cut, but it's also good for pin pricks and needle pricks when you are sewing. So if you've pricked your finger and it starts to bleed, put a bandage on it before it starts getting worse and getting blood all over your project. As an aside note, if you do get a drop of blood on your project, the way to get the blood out is to use your own saliva. That's the best way. I know it sounds gross. You can either take the fabric and put it in your mouth and lick it and suck on it, or you can spit on a piece of tissue or something, facial tissue, and rub it or blot it or something. But your own saliva will get your own blood out of any kind of washable fabric. So prevent yourself from getting more blood than necessary on your project by using band-aids. You can use the plain ones, but you could also use Wonder Woman ones because there are lots of fun designs out there made for kids, but who says you can't have those in your sewing kit as well? And last but not least, the tool that I recommend that you consider getting is a thimble. Now, I did not give my students, my classroom students, a thimble because they were just beginning. And when you're just beginning, you're just getting your positioning, where you hold the needle, where you hold the, how you thread it, how you hold the fabric, how you do your stitches, how you push the needle through the fabric, with what finger and with what part of your finger. You're just getting that sort of set in your muscle memory. And until you know where you're gonna, what part of your middle finger on your dominant hand that you're gonna use to push the needle through the fabric, you might not need a thimble. Or if you do, the thimble might not actually cover the part of your finger that you use. For me, I have actually not used a thimble. I've been sewing for over 20 years, and I have thimbles. I inherited a thimble from my mom, but it's too big for me. Thimbles also come in sizes. Thimbles, this is, as you can see, you might be able to see, there's some space between the thimble and my finger. That's what you don't want. You want your thimble to fit your finger snugly. Now, this thimble actually comes up all the way up to my first joint of my middle finger. A thimble that fits you will not generally come up that far unless you get a really long thimble. There are lots of different kinds of thimbles, actually. There are leather thimbles that are longer. So here is my thimble, my silver thimble. And I put it on, I can shake my hand, it doesn't fall off. It's recommended that if you're gonna use a thimble, you put it on your finger and you just wear it like a ring until you forget that it's there, until you get used to wearing it, even when you're not sewing. Unless, of course, you're washing your hands, and you should take it off so you don't lose your thimble. But this covers, and because it is very snugly on my finger, it's not gonna come off. The problem for me is that my hands are small, as you can see. If you happen to have small hands, then when you're using the needle, different sizes of needles, the end of the needle, the blunt end of the needle that you push through the fabric might not hit your finger at the very tip, or even near the very tip at the side, which is what a thimble of this style is designed to protect your finger, that part of your finger, your fingertip. With my hands, I use the side of my finger to press the needle through, and it's this spot right here at my knuckle that ends up pressing the blunt end of the needle. And as you can see, my knuckle is not covered by the thimble. So whenever I've worn a thimble, tried to use a thimble, it doesn't actually end up protecting my finger. It gets in the way. It's annoying. So I almost always don't use a thimble. Now, what that means is that the blunt end of the needle, and certain needles have a sharper blunt end than others, it does poke your finger. It makes your finger very sore. Once you get started sewing, if you find that part of your finger is getting sore, you should protect your skin. You should protect your finger. You can put a bandage on your finger, but the needle will soon prick through that. The blunt end of the needle will soon poke a hole in that. So it is a good idea to have a thimble. There are lots of different sizes, and there are lots of different styles. Recently, I got a thimble that's like this. It's a ring. Ring style thimbles are traditionally called tailor's thimbles. And they're good because you can put them all the way up on your finger or down to cover the part of your finger apart from the tip that pushes the needle through. Now, they also come in sizes. They're kind of hard to find in sizes. This thimble, my fingers are really small, like I said. So this thimble, I've had to sort of overlap the two ends and resize them, and it's still a little bit big, but it's probably gonna work at least better than the regular traditional seamstress's thimble. So that's something that I would encourage you to think about. I would not say, however, that you need it absolutely when you first begin. So that's a little bit controversial. There are several well-known YouTube sewing people, costumers, who say you must have a thimble, you must have a thimble, get a thimble, use a thimble. I'm not one of those people. Like I said, I've sewed for 20 years without a thimble. What happens? My finger gets sore. It gets sore. But also it develops a callus. I have a callus on that part of my finger from my finger getting poked so many times with the blunt end of a needle. So I leave that on the end of the list so that you can decide for yourself. Like I said, there are lots of different kinds and styles and shapes of thimbles. You can get metal thimbles. You can get leather thimbles. Leather thimbles are generally a little bit larger than the metal ones, but they also only go up to that first joint. So if you're like me and you have small hands and you are discovering that the needle, the blunt end of the needle, is not hitting your fingertip, the side of your fingertip, it's hitting on the side of your finger, and it's about at the joint, and your hands are not, the way your joints are built, it's not really possible or easy or comfortable for you to bend your finger more so that the tip of your finger will hit the needle. Maybe consider a tailor's thimble or a ring thimble. If you search for them online, they're usually called ring thimbles. Lots of different types. This is one type. There are some that have padding on the inside. There are some that are just a complete ring and they're not adjustable. And like I said, there are leather thimbles as well, different kinds of quilting thimbles that are longer. So lots of different thimbles that you can look at and consider. But that is something that is useful. A lot of seamstresses find thimbles to be necessary. So once you get started sewing, if you are going to continue, and if you really like hand sewing and would like to do it without very much pain, then a thimble is a good tool and something that I do recommend once you have gotten started already. But it's not necessary for you to have one at the very beginning. Thanks for joining me as we finished our series on the kinds of tools that I think hand sewers should have when they begin sewing. I hope this information has been helpful for you, and I hope it's been useful in your choosing the tools that you need in order to get started hand sewing. I hope you feel more confident and more knowledgeable, and please let me know what projects you're doing. If you liked this content, please give this video a like. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like more content. The next sewing video is going to be a sewing sampler, how to make a sewing or a stitch sampler. We're not doing anything fancy, no embroidery. We're just practicing our stitches. So that will be the next sewing video. If you're interested, come on back and take a look at that. I've also started making some historic cooking videos. So if you're interested in historic cooking, please come back and take a look at that. Everybody take care and stay safe. Bye.